Welcome, everybody, to the New America Foundation. My name is Andres Martinez. I run the Fellows Program here at New America. And I grew up in Mexico, and it's completely coincidental that the shot that we have today is the onside first goal of yesterday's glorious win of Mexico over France. The ESPN commentator said that this is the first time Mexico has beaten France, and so clearly they're not aware of the story behind Cinco de Mayo. But anyways, I also root for Germany. That's kind of my adopted team in World Cups, and so I'm in the unusual position of being more worried about the Germans than I am about the Mexicans this World Cup, given what happened this morning. But before I proceed with the substance of this very important subject of the World Cup, I do want to remind everybody that this event is being filmed live on the web, and so any comments you make will be on the record for posterity. Let me introduce and also at the end of this, we'll have beer and empanadas are going to make an appearance at some point, and the Slovenia-England game will be shown, which starts at Algeria. Sorry, Algeria, England at 2:30. I'm thinking of Slovenia because some of my colleagues earlier were grumbling that they hate Slovenia, which I'd never heard anybody say. And but I'm glad that mild-mannered American think tankers are getting in the spirit of the World Cup. Let me introduce our panel today. We have Nick Schmidl, Dayo Alapati, both of whom are Schwartz Fellows here at the New America Foundation, and Charles Kenny, who's an economist at the World Bank and a contributing editor to Foreign Policy magazine, and Frank Foer, the editor of the New Republic and author of How Soccer Explains the World. So thanks all for being here. Let me just continue to talk a little bit before we get into the panel discussion about how glorious Mexico's win was yesterday. Because really. No, I did. I grew up in Mexico. I lived there till I was 15, and as many of you know, in a lot of the world, the World Cups, I feel like they punctuated my childhood. I can, have vivid memories of 74 and 78, and they seem to be sort of the punctuation marks of my childhood. And I came to the States when I was 15, and I feel like I've been sort of a missionary for the game. And I was an editorial writer for 4 years at the New York Times, and my boss there liked to joke that I was the editorial writer covering soccer early in the from 2000 to 2004, because I would find any excuse to write about soccer. And in fact, I printed out the absolute low point of my journalistic career was a correction that ran in the New York Times on November 4th, 2000. It says, an editorial on Thursday about Brazil's national soccer team misidentified a player allegedly pressured to play while ill. He is Ronaldo, not Romario. And I met, on the positive side, I managed to write an editorial about an investigation going on in Brazil about corruption in soccer. And part of the inquiry was about whether Nike and others had pressured Ronaldo to play in the 1998 World Cup final. And I was writing this on deadline, as one does, and just wrote Romario instead of Ronaldo, understanding the difference. It's two, great Brazilian soccer players of different generations. And this created quite a firestorm in Brazil. The press went crazy that the New York Times, those ignorant gringos did not understand the difference. And wasn't it, that they would misidentify, that they would confuse Ronaldo and Romario. And Larry Roeder, who was the New York Times correspondent in Brazil, said, nothing that the Times has ever done has given me created such problems for me. I might have to leave the country, and, they're about to torch my house. And I came to a think tank after that. So, but here I was, trying to spread the message, and I created this complete chaos by perpetuating the myth that Americans are ignorant about soccer. And one of the things that always kind of attracted me about the disconnect between the sort of American domination of pop culture in the world and our sort of sports exceptionalism. I mean, the fact that that disconnect is very striking, and it's changing now. Obviously, we're more connected to the game. The U.S. goes to World Cups, does fairly well. Today's score notwithstanding, but generally, soccer is the one aspect of global pop culture that is not dominated by the U.S. Anything else that people in different countries have in common, it's that cross borders, it's Hollywood movies, it's American music, and soccer is the one sort of global common reference that still is not sort of a product that's dominated by the U.S., which is why so much of the world is very anxious, I think, about the ascendance of U.S. soccer and the prospect that the U.S. one of these days could win a World Cup, and we'll sort of care, but not to the same extent. And I think the rest of the world will feel like they've lost this one kind of aspect of culture that wasn't made in the U.S. Before. And I used to talk about this sort of thing, and people said, you should write a book. And it was around that time that this great book came out, How Soccer Explains the World. And I think I got 13 copies of this for Christmas. So, it's great when somebody writes the book you wanted to write, and Frank did such a terrific job. And then, to get everybody sort of rubbing it in by giving it to you, it's just fantastic. And I was talking to an agent, I said, well, I don't think this really preempts the field. I mean, How Soccer Explains the World, that's a pretty narrowly, framed, of course I want to write How Soccer Explains the Galaxy, so it shouldn't be a problem. But anyways, enough rambling from me to start off. I do want to, on this aspect of, how the sport and nationalism and culture intersect, that we kind of revel in during the World Cup. One of the things that's very striking is how the U.S. isn't the only kind of new market for soccer. The sport is continuing to spread. When we think of sort of the World Cup was a very Western preserve. I mean, when we think of imperialism, and I want to turn to Dio in a second because she's written about this. There's a tendency to think in terms of North-South terms, but if you think about it, football, soccer, and the World Cup has been a very sort of Western property. For decades Europe would have it one time, and then it would go to Latin America. So it wasn't North-South in the sense that it was really the West. And Mexico got 2 World Cups, and it was the shared sort of Atlantic community bequest. And then it was quite striking that in 2002, the first time this pattern was broken, and FIFA sort of deigned to share the World Cup with a country that was not part of the Americas or Europe. They handed it off to Asia, and they said, but, Japan, Korea, you need to share it because, God knows how often we're going to want to sort of depart from the Atlantic community, and, people are all sort of the same. It was a very kind of striking, that's kind of how it came across, because clearly in terms of infrastructure and wherewithal, Korea or Japan could have pulled this off on their own. And fast forward 8 years, though, and there's sort of a poignancy that now Africa has a World Cup, and I think that's one of the striking victories of the democratization of the sport, but also of how far South Africa has come. So Dio, what are the elements that strike you? Because you wrote about this in the Atlantic, about the sort of colonial former colonies playing the sort of old imperial powers and the kind of level playing field. And what does this represent for not just South Africa, but Africa more broadly?
Well, I think the World Cup is literally level playing field. I don't think there's anything about anything else on the planet that rivals it in scope. Obviously, there are only 32 teams, and so it's limited. But the qualification rounds and the whole process of traveling from the group stage to the very final, buzzer at the final in, I think it's Johannesburg this year, implicates almost the entire world. I think, even if you were to compare it, it's apples to oranges, but to the Super Bowl, the World Cup final is predicted to touch about 1 billion people, if not more. And I think the uniqueness of the scope really does make it all the more powerful that you're having all eyes of the world on the continent of Africa. Obviously, there's a sort of a history of exclusion for parts of the world, including Africa, Latin America, even Asia in certain cases. But again, the unification of the entire world sort of watching one place, and the opportunity for, I think, similarly to Beijing in 2008, for a country to sort of show its national pride has all kinds of wonderful implications, the vuvuzela notwithstanding. I think that might be the one cultural artifact we'll take from this World Cup in South Africa. But there are so many more other things to see the different styles of play among different countries. And as I mentioned in the article, it's wonderful that any team could beat any other team, and we've seen some upsets, not just today, but throughout the opening stages of the tournament. But that the teams themselves are changing, that the teams themselves have different faces from different ethnic backgrounds, all playing under the same flag. And I think that just really does demonstrate what a universalizing and sort of great and also massively entertaining spectacle the World Cup is.
One thing that's interesting on this concept of a level playing field is you do see a lot more parity. Few teams, for instance, have played as well so far as sort of the Ivory Coast. And yet it's also true that there's no player on the Ivory Coast team that does not play in Europe.
Right.
So you have parity in terms of the national teams, but you still have this sort of Europe-centric, more so than ever before probably, in terms of even in Argentina and Brazil and the Latin teams, they can't, those leagues can't afford to retain the players and keep them from going to Europe. So how does that fit into your thesis? And maybe, Dio, after you, Charles, could weigh in on sort of, it's an interesting kind of parallel to other, migration patterns and other labor forces in terms of, you have the positive of, I guess, remittances in a sense, Drogba and other African players playing in Europe, are accumulating great wealth that at a certain point, in some ways, will likely get repatriated. But there's, if not a brain drain, there's a sort of soccer talent drain, and a brain drain too. But Dio, how does that?
I've been watching all the teams, almost all of the games, which is has been hard and difficult.
She's also been working really hard, though.
Yeah, but the African teams are interesting in that there is this sort of question of authenticity and representation that implicates some of the African teams. I know that I believe it's Ghana and Nigeria have hired coaches from Sweden to take their team the last lap through the tournament after qualification. And yes, a lot of the players do play abroad. And I mentioned in my article Frank's wonderful writing about Nigerian players in Eastern Europe. And this sort of transfer of talent is part of a new type of globalization. And I would also note that the wonderful Nigerian goalkeeper, Vincent Enyeama, plays in Israel. He lives in Tel Aviv for most of the year. And so I think there is sort of a wonderful spread of talent. But of course, the commercialization of football and the I guess we could point to that spectacular Nike ad that preceded the tournament as a sort of the Lenny Riefenstahl moment for soccer, a testament to the glorification of individual players over teams. And I think, if anything, the migration of players to Europe has taken away from the African teams' performances in that they don't have as much time to spend kicking the ball around together. Hopefully by the end of the tournament, all the teams are playing with cohesion. But that is one danger in having the exportation of talent abroad.
Charles, you have something to add on this?
I have to say, I would strongly disagree. Sorry. I think it's a great thing that these players can move. Take the example of US soccer. Is it really plausible that the US team will get as far as it has if all the players had only been playing in the US league? They wouldn't be playing against the best players in the world. And to take an extreme example, the US opposition today, I think there are about 750,000 male Slovenes of adult age. Now, and
they knocked out Russia in the qualifying round.
Right.
That's the reason Russia's not in the World Cup, is because of Slovenia.
And so if all Slovenes had to play against other Slovenes before they got to the World Cup, is it really plausible to imagine that they would ever get to the World Cup at all? So I think that the benefits of migration here as with the benefits of migration in general, are really very positive on both where the players come from and where the players end up.
Frank is itching to get in here.
Yeah, no, there's I would recommend to everybody. There's an excellent article in Der Spiegel this month, which has been translated into English about African migration to Europe, and that I agree that on the whole it's probably for the good for these African national soccer teams. But there's also a very dark side to the global soccer economy, which is that there's a real fetish for buying African players in Europe, and there's a market that involves a lot of very, very sketchy agents who go deep into Africa and end up promising kids from the sticks that they're going to become the next Didier Drogba, and then they take them to Eastern Europe or to provincial clubs in Western Europe, and oftentimes they're just abandoned because they don't fit into the club on their first day of tryouts, and the coach decides that these players suck, and they're just kind of abandoned by these agents. And so the UN just published a report where it found there are some 4,000 African kids who've been imported into Europe by these unscrupulous agents, and many of them have been are now child prostitutes or homeless, or they're just kind of left at sea. So I think that on balance, it's good, but there's also a very, very dark underbelly to this whole dodgy economy.
Have you? I should mention that the New Republic. You can link to a blog, an excellent blog that Frank is running during the World Cup. Or is there a separate link that?
It's called Goalpost. You can get it from our homepage, tnr.com.
Goalpost. And is this article linked to it there?
It's there. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for
Great.
the plug.
Yeah, that's a plug.
Yeah. Next year,
Another item.
We're gonna have it on your jersey.
Another item of housekeeping. Speaking of my jersey, two things. One is this is not this World Cup's jersey. I'm waiting for that one to go on sale. This is a couple of years old. Second, I was wearing this yesterday for the game here, as many of you know, and I do want to assure everybody that it got washed overnight.
That's good.
So,
I was actually that.
so moving on, Frank. Another thing that I was actually thinking about your book this morning, and because one of the very powerful chapters is about Serbia,
Right.
and how sport and soccer kind of helped mold sort of cultural identity and nationalism among the Belgrade clubs and Serbia writ large. And it's actually, I was thinking, here Serbia today upsets Germany. You had, tiny Slovenia play the U.S. to a draw after winning its first game. Croatia, for a couple of World Cups there, was a real Cinderella team, and I think made it to the semifinals once. And, geez, that whole Yugoslav breakup, I mean, if that hadn't happened, you'd have quite a powerhouse.
Right. Well, perhaps they never performed that great when they were.
Yeah. So what does that tell us about? Should the U.S. break up and have four different teams?
Perhaps. I actually think that the best team in the tournament could very well be the Catalan national team. And I watched Catalonia crush Argentina in a friendly that they played earlier this year. And if you look at the spine of the Spanish team, Xavi, Iniesta, Busquets, Puyol, Piqué, those are all guys of Catalan origin who would happily play for the Catalan team. And there's actually been moments where people have argued that the Spanish national team has never, and one of the reasons it's underachieved historically is that it's had these ethnic splits, and it's had coaches who've never been able to totally successfully navigate those ethnic differences. And then Germany and Serbia, the thing that I think about is I love matches where World War II is a subtext. Because
I was thinking World War I, but either one.
It just because it always makes everything so much better. I mean, people say that the Dutch never got past World War II until the Dutch played the Germans in the 1988 European Championships, where Frank Rijkaard was able to spit on Rudy Voller, and that was just the moment where the Dutch were like, "Yes,
we're even."
We don't need. You may have conquered us, we may have collaborated, but damn it, we're spitting on you.
If I may wave a flag for Britain for a moment. I think one of the signs of what a wonderful and generous country Britain is that actually we have split up into 4 different national
Right.
teams. You know, if we hadn't done that, we'd actually be ahead of Argentina in the World Cup rankings on wins and losses. But of course, we don't worry about Argentina.
That's
at all in
actually-
Britain. So you know, that's one way you can tell we're a generous country. The other way, obviously, is with our choice of goalie, who is very keen that everybody ought to get to score a goal one time or another.
It's so true that only during the World Cup am I ever aware of the flag of England. You see those stadiums with that red cross, the flag of St. George, I guess you call it, and you don't see what we usually think of as the flag of Britain because you field all these different teams. Frank mentioned Catalonia, so that's a good segue to bring in Nick, who's wearing the Barcelona jersey. And
The shirt of Catalonia.
Yes, it's the greatest team not in the World Cup. But Nick, why don't you? I think we should bring in the subject of American exceptionalism and the fact that we as a country have been immune from the fever of this sport and play our own sports and feel quite passionate about them. What got into you? When did you realize that there was this other game out there, and then sort of extrapolating from your personal how you got into soccer? Maybe talk a little bit about if you have a grand theory about why it is that the U.S. has been slow to catch this fever.
All right, so that's a good way of prompting me to say that I don't have a grand theory of how colonialism or globalization affects soccer. The only reason why Andres has invited me to be on the panel is A, because he loves Barcelona and he knew that I like Barcelona, and
I couldn't wear both jerseys.
And as one of the advantages of being a freelancer is that your lunches are free. So I usually play pickup soccer 5 times a week, around from 12 to 2. It carves out a large part of my day. So the exceptionalism question, ever since you told me you wanted me to talk about that, I had been sort of wrestling with it. And then I met this real anti-soccer curmudgeon today for lunch, just before I came here. And his comment to me was, introduce the PGA and the LPGA to Ghana, and then let's see if the Ghanaians are still as excited about soccer. Let's give them some variety of sports. And he said, look, we talk about soccer, that everyone loves soccer more, but they don't have the choices. And I think that
it's a monopoly, huh?
The reason, I mean, it's the simplicity, of course, but the reason I think why Americans have not caught on to soccer up until now is there are a couple of reasons. First of which is that there haven't been any stars to identify with. There haven't been. I mean, we tried bringing David Beckham to the Galaxy in L.A. and it was a total flop. There's no one. There are no sort of good-looking superstars that young Americans can all rally around. Clint Dempsey is a great player, but he's not heartthrob sort of front cover of Vanity Fair-esque. So you have that element. The other element you have is that despite patriotism, I mean, I have a father and brother in the military. I'm plenty patriotic, but I would never wear a U.S. jersey. There are so many other good, interesting teams out there to watch and to root for. And so I think that this World Cup has shown some variance in the creativity of the American side. But up until now, I think that it's generally been they've played a predictable brand of ball, and it's reflected in the lack of enthusiasm at a public level. But one last point about the pickup games, I do think that the grassroots community explosion and interest in soccer is growing. And I think that when you look at other countries around the world, for instance China, where I just came back from, and I left right before the World Cup began there, but they were getting very geared up to watch the World Cup, and yet no one in China actually plays soccer. And it was an interesting dichotomy that you didn't have that sort of community grassroots interest, and yet you had that sports bar TV interest.
China is a fascinating, it's a battleground, I think, because during the Cultural Revolution and in that whole period, sports were taboo in many ways. It's kind of it's a neutral ground where you see the NBA and American sports vying with European soccer for the marketplace and for the hearts and minds. And you walk down the streets of Beijing or Shanghai and you're likely to see as many, you see Barcelona and Manchester United jerseys, but you also see lots of NBA jerseys.
Andres, were you here during the NASL?
I followed it a little bit. I was still living in Mexico.
I was just reminded of that Nick's comment. It's the North American Soccer League, which thrived.
San Diego Sockers.
Well, so the point is that Nick talks about how you would never wear an American jersey, And the biggest teams in this league that we were creating to try to make soccer a big thing here were called the Diplomats and the Cosmopolitans. And I think that's all you need to know about why soccer is doomed in this country.
I also would add that, just in terms of the talent that exists in the United States, obviously population is no indicator. India has never, India is terrible at soccer. They've not even contemplated playing. Same with other former British colonies in Southeast Asia. China's not particularly good, though they did make a run, I guess, in 2002. The U.S. has 300 million people. Russia has however many people are in Russia. But, as you were saying, the tiny Slovenian team, really made a good run for qualifying today. But more broadly, I guess, despite the fact that 300 million people in the United States, you have hockey, you have basketball, you have baseball, you have football. You have other sports that the best athletes can compete in, and those leagues are themselves the best in the world. And so it's tough for, it's easy to sort of imagine an alternative universe in which LeBron James is given a soccer ball, but all of the cultural and commercial forces are pushing people into other sports where, soccer might be, let's say, seventh, if we're being generous. Once you factor in, high school lacrosse and other type of things that young people in America do. Whereas in a country like Uruguay or in a country like Nigeria, even, soccer is the sport, and it's the case for lots of countries. And so,
but it's interesting to think of why that evolved, and some of the various theories. And Frank, I'd be curious to get your thoughts. One theory was that soccer was a very TV unfriendly sport because there are no natural breaks for commercials, and in Europe and in Latin America where TV was all public, that didn't matter. Another theory is that immigrants to the United States, to assimilate, were quick to drop the sport of the home country early on in the 20th century. You have all these theories. I think now, yes, it's a crowded marketplace. But Frank, do you have a definitive grand theory that's going to explain this?
Yeah, sure. I trade in this. So a couple points. One is I find the idea that soccer is un-American to be a very pernicious statement. It's Karl Rovian type logic where these troglodytes who don't like the game decide that they're going to define everybody who likes the game as somehow outside the mainstream of the country, when in fact there are more people who play the game here than in 95% of the countries around the world. We've had wave after wave of immigrants from the soccer playing world who've brought the game here, and sometimes in the course of assimilation they've dropped the game, but oftentimes they kept playing the game, and there are just millions and millions of people who play the game, and ratings are very high for this World Cup, and ratings are actually pretty high on ESPN for the English Premier League games, and there is a market for soccer. But I understand the question's somewhat different. The question is, why isn't soccer on the same level as the NBA or Major League Baseball? And I think that the answer to that has more to do with luck and just in history than it does with anything having to do with the game itself, which is that so when we had these waves of soccer playing countries come in the late 19th, early 20th century, there were thriving leagues for various times in this country, but there was a narrow window when this country went from being highly fragmented to having a national culture. And in the 1920s and 30s, we had the advent of movie reels and radio, and then later television, and soccer just happened to unluckily be very disorganized at the highest professional level during that period, and so we were just doomed to miss our great chance to break through, and so we've been struggling to break through ever since. And in the 1970s, it looked like soccer was gonna break through. You had giant stadiums selling out to watch the New York Cosmos. There's my favorite story from that era was Pele was deemed an unexportable natural resource by the Brazilians in the 1970s in order to prevent him from going to Juventus or some other Italian club. And so in order to Warner, which was the Warner Communications, which was orchestrating the birth of this new soccer league, along with the Ahmet brothers who formed Atlantic Records. had Henry Kissinger call the vice president of Brazil and tell him that it would be very much be in Brazil's national interest if Pelé was allowed to come to the United States. And so Brazil let Pelé come. And
That's great.
but the stadiums were filled. The games were being broadcast on ABC. And the game was actually too successful for its own good in the 1970s. It became this real fad, and everybody saw dollar signs. And so they overexpanded the league to, I think, there were 30 cities that had NASL franchises. There were the Tampa, what was the Tampa?
I remember the San Diego Sockers because we went and saw a game.
Yeah, when you're stuck calling teams the San Diego Sockers, you know you've exhausted your creativity, and so the game failed.
Right.
And we're just
Yeah,
stuck
the
in
MLS
this
has been
endless
a long
cycle.
I wanted to. Dio mentioned something very interesting, which is that India is another country
Rubbish.
that is not. I'm sorry.
India's rubbish at soccer.
Yeah, India is
Who knows why?
just not a factor, and so you have this other kind of paradox of the Charles's people invent the game, get it going, and its colonies are all kind of absent, and there's sort of a class. But I get your thoughts on why Pakistan, India, and these former British colonies are never been to a World Cup, and all they picked up was cricket and squash and other British things. And then and Nick, you lived in Pakistan for 2 years and wrote a great book about it. So any thoughts you have on that part of the world too would be interesting.
My theory on the United States is that the United States, when it comes to sports, is kind of the Galapagos Islands. Development stopped too early. So in Britain, when we're little young lads, we play a game called rounders, which involves a stick like that. You bat it like that. Then you grow up and you play cricket. And we have a game called rugby, which is somewhat like your American football, except without the pads, you panty waists. Anyway, but your games are kind of earlier versions. It's like, I believe American English is actually closer to what Shakespeare spoke than British English, but Britain moved on. Now, the reason I think that the United States isn't quite as good as it could be at soccer is because, frankly, 1776 came too early. If you do look at other parts of the British Empire that hung around a bit longer, you kind of dismissed cricket there, but India actually, regularly beats Britain at cricket. Australia always beats England at cricket unless, I don't know, there's a lightning strike. New Zealand constantly clobbering Britain in rugby. The reason that it was such a sad and boring draw, US-England, is that you didn't keep your loyalty to the Queen long enough. Had you only done that, you'd have wiped the floor with us. And I think that's the big problem.
Nick?
So exercising, generally speaking, in Pakistan is difficult because men are wearing shalwar kameez, or as the military calls them, man jammies. And it's just in security issues, wearing shorts is difficult. So when we first got to Pakistan, we were at an Afghan restaurant one night, and I met some Afghans who said that they played soccer, and that was like my entree into actually having a way to exercise. And these guys played on the most disastrous field ever. I mean, it was an ankle sprain waiting to happen. And interestingly, so I kind of was playing with them and slowly working my way up to people who had access to better fields and better fields and better fields, and finally started playing with the British High Commission team. And the British High Commission, because of security reasons, you walk through the British High Commission front door and you go through 5 levels of security and you keep walking, and all of a sudden at the back of the British High Commission is like Wembley Field. I mean, the thing is absolutely pitch perfect. The field is rolled. There's not a single duff in the grass. There's stadium lights. There's stadium seating. And I was like, all right, so I got to figure out how to find a way onto this field. So I started playing with the Brits. Now, the interesting thing was that there were no Pakistani teams to play. They would play against Afghans, but the only Afghans that were on the Afghan team that they played against were, interestingly, Tajiks and Hazaras. So there wasn't the perceived security issue of bringing Pashtuns onto the British High Commission field. But there were never any Pakistani teams, and they played against other internationals. So, my experience with soccer in Pakistan was a great one, but there was no sort of grassroots interest. Ricky and I, for the '06 World Cup, happened to be in India, and there was great amount of TV interest in watching the World Cup. There was just no one playing in the streets or the alleys.
And that's always the case. You don't have kids kicking around ragtag balls in Pakistan the way you
No,
have in
it's
Holland.
all. I mean, it's all cricket all the time.
That's-
Yeah, in man jammies.
There's actually within Islam there is somewhat of a debate over the halalness of soccer. That in Somalia right now,
Right.
there are fans who are who are being persecuted and I think there were fans who were actually killed for watching
Right.
World Cup matches and
Both the major Islamist groups have said that it's haram to be watching. any
Yeah.
soccer
And I
games.
believe there was a killing in Somalia this World Cup related
Right.
to someone
Right.
watching the World Cup.
So
Dio, who's going to win this World Cup?
Oh, that's hard. Everyone, there's just been so many implosions of teams that I really had favored after the first round of group play. I thought Germany looked spectacular against Australia. I thought the Ivory Coast looked excellent against Portugal. I guess the second game will sort of determine, which team will prevail. Spain, of course, was a favorite, but then went down to Switzerland. Brazil is always good, and so is Argentina. But I don't know if they're pushed. Whether the defenses will hold. And I guess I forget who I was talking with the wonderful Steve Tellis, who's also in America, about whether there is a possible correlation between GDP and defensive capabilities. And I think we'll have to do more research before we conclude anything about that. But I've just been really surprised, and again, this goes back to the sort of theme of the egalitarianism, that really any team can win on any day, and groups can shift in a minute, and then in the knockout phase, it's really anyone's guess. And just looking at the overlay of geopolitics is lovely as a way of viewing this very unpredictable tournament. And again, it's about they're proxies for nations, and so it's more fun if you sort of remember their histories and how they interacted in the past. But it's also just about players. I love the players who were on the same team, or on the same club team, but then end up playing together, or against one
Or against
another.
each other,
Yeah, which is always interesting. And I always wonder how they communicate, particularly on club teams as it compares to the World Cup. And whether if Portugal plays Angola, is it an advantage to overhear what the team is saying, or is it a disadvantage? And I just love the sort of the mixing of different. Just different geopolitical backgrounds over this hugely important cup.
Do you think this is paying off for South Africa? I mean, there's always this debate when countries invest tremendously to put on a big showcase event like this. And I mean, the poignancy is clear. The resonance of the fact that you have people who were political prisoners, on Robben Island, and we've all read the stories about the soccer league they had there, and now they're hosting this World Cup, and a country that couldn't have vied to be in the World Cup before because of its apartheid system now hosting this. I mean, it's moving and poignant. But in terms of, is there an actual sort of payoff for South Africa going forward?
I think probably yes. But I don't know. I mean, this is the sort of same question you get whenever. This is the argument for having the Olympics in the same place every 4 years. You just build it all in Athens, go there every 4 years, and stop dealing with the sort of the logistics and the expense that, for example, London is going through right now, where they're trying to get ready for the 2012 Olympics. Obviously, Rio is an advantage in hosting the Olympics and the World Cup, so they can just do a one-shot kind of deal. But it is enormously expensive, and it's there have been reports of people being just sort of
Displaced.
put in trucks and like moved out away from the stadium because you want to look fresh and clean for the visitors. I do think that there are the people who will go and stay, and I'm going and staying for the back half of the World Cup. After this weekend, we'll probably get to experience, different parts of South Africa. If you're following your own team, I have friends who are following the United States, from Rustenburg to Pretoria to Bloemfontein, so they really are getting an experience of the country. And I think the rest of the world, as I said earlier, getting to see South Africa, getting to see different types of soccer, different teams, and having the eyes focused on a formerly apartheid state is all well and good. The question really becomes whether or not the economic benefits of building a bunch of things persist after the stadiums sit empty, and a place like Bloemfontein is in the middle of nowhere, and yet there's an 80,000 seat stadium that will just sit there. So it remains to be seen, and I do hope South Africa does well, although it doesn't look like they're going to make it out of the group stage. But again, much like India or Pakistan, that is a country where soccer isn't the sport.
Right. Charles, what about the payoff for winning a World Cup? I mean, it's interesting that Dio
Diaz mentioned that it feels like any country can win on any given day, and that's always true. It feels that way in the first stage, and you often have a Cinderella team make it pretty deep into the tournament, and yet we've never really had a real shocker in terms of a random upstart country in the soccer world win a World Cup. There's sort of certain dynasties, and I think it's only 8 countries that have ever won a World Cup. 7?
7. Yeah.
Oh, so it's even worse than I thought. I was trying to count with my fingers yesterday. But and Brazil having won 5, and 2 countries having won 3, and so we still haven't gotten to the point where one of these upstarts really actually wins the whole thing. But Charles, what is the payoff economically for winning the World Cup? Let's get serious here.
Well, just to Dale's point, I absolutely agree with you. If you kind of look at the numbers on hosting the World Cup, in strict economic terms, it looks fairly grim. I mean, so South Korea spent $2 billion on stadiums and got $307 million in tourism revenues. Not a terribly good payoff. On the other hand, we earn money supposedly in order to enjoy spending it. And I mean, in a way, this clearly South Africa's having a good
Throwing
time.
itself
I guess.
A party. Right?
Yeah. So maybe this is somewhere where economics doesn't have much to say. We know FIFA is going to make a lot of money. The global monopoly that it is. As to the winner, there's some sort of reasonably careful academic research that suggests in Britain, if the UK wins a European Cup or a World Cup match, the stock market goes up 0.3% the next day. If it loses, it goes down 0.2%. So any of you who believe in stock markets reflecting fundamental values of companies, not so much. When it comes to actually winning the World Cup winners as a whole are miserable economic performers. Before and after they win the World Cup, they underperform the global average. I did a little bit of research which would not make it into the American Economic Review on this subject. The 10 years before a country wins the World Cup, on average they are growing 0.5 percentage point slower than the average country around the world. The good news is winning a World Cup doesn't make you grow faster than average, but it does make you grow faster than you were before. So your gap with the rest of the world goes up to only 0.1% behind the global average. This does, I think, actually bring up an interesting statistic for a subject that I don't think got enough coverage in your book, if I may, which is what soccer teaches us about the divine. Because if you look at the 1986 World Cup, there was apparently divine intervention in one of the results. There was a famous Argentina-England game, as it happens.
You people can't get over it. You always bring it up.
When Maradona said that the goal went in thanks, I think, partially to Maradona's foot and partially thanks to the hand of God. Photos afterwards would suggest it was the hand of God made flesh. But leaving that aside for a minute, God intervened and basically helped Argentina win. I should point out Maradona later in that game did an absolutely stunning and completely legit performance, I think, on the world's best goal. But the first goal, a little bit suspect, and they won 2-1. So it is.
I think it was 3-1.
2-1. I remember. The result was that Argentina went on to win. Now, this, according to my earlier calculations, means that Argentina's economy grew by about $13.5 billion. So, God did a favour to Argentina. Of course, had Britain gone on to win that game, had God felt otherwise that day, Britain's economy being somewhat larger and more populous, Britain's economy would have grown by $60 billion. And I think this tells you that the Heritage Foundation is wrong. Clearly, God cares a lot more about the global spread of wealth and that everybody has some money, rather than the absolute size of the pie and Britain getting a lot richer than Argentina. I have to say I agree with God on this one.
When was the last time Britain won a World Cup?
Oh, the 60s. It was just the one.
66, right?
Is there any correlation to declining numbers for the Church of England then?
The year I was born. England hasn't won in my entire life. So, Frank, who's going to win?
Well, I'm horrible at making these predictions.
These are like one-word answer questions.
No, but I'm gonna
mention like every country playing.
I'm gonna go to my island and change the subject, which is to the team that I'm most in love with in this tournament, which other than the United States, and I do have a lot of affection for Spain because of my allegiance to Catalonia and to Barcelona, but which is Chile, which I don't know if ever people have been watching Chile play, but I recommend it, and I think that one of the most entertaining matches of the tournament is going to be when Chile plays Spain, because you have the two teams. Chile is coached by a guy named Marcelo Bielsa, who is Argentine, and he's a massive eccentric who he's like some sort of 19th century novelist who lives alone in a hovel, even though he's getting paid millions of dollars, and he often doesn't collect his checks from the Chilean Federation. He spends all his time watching videotapes. He's got this collection of like 3,000 videotapes that he sits and watches all day long. And he's got some woman that the Federation has attend to him, and so he doesn't totally shrivel up, and he doesn't forget to eat. And he sits but he's a romantic, and he believes that he doesn't really care. He cares about winning, but he cares mostly about playing attractive, attacking soccer. There's this great debate in Argentina between pragmatism and romanticism, and he's squarely on the side of romanticism. And so Chile is playing in this very romantic style of play where you often have 7 guys attacking at the same time, and it's not just it's not kind of joyous improvised attacking. It's very highly practiced, and so he took over this gardener's shed next to the pitch in Santiago, next to in the training complex, where he installed his VCR and watches tapes. And when players don't understand what he's saying, he takes them in and makes them watch the video, and then he'll blindfold them so that they're doing their choreographed moves in the right sort of way. And they've just been an absolute joy to watch in that first match that they played against Honduras, and then playing against Spain. Spain is the other team that in the tournament that they don't quite play attacking football, but they play kind of beautiful passing football. And so tactically, it's going to be fascinating to see how Bielsa is able to counter the Spanish style of possession with his ideological commitment to attacking. And so that's my my long-winded homage to Marcelo Bielsa, who's also known as El Loco.
El Loco. That's a good thing to be known as. Dunga is sort of an interesting counter study, right? I mean, talk a little bit about the Brazilian debate about this.
Well, Dunga, so interestingly, I mean, I think one of the storylines of the first set of games is that the South American teams have done extraordinarily well. They haven't lost a game in the tournament yet. And I think all the South American coaches, even Maradona, have kind of they have strong views about tactics. And Dunga has very strong views about tactics. He's the Brazilian coach. He was a star in the 1994 World Cup. He's a holding midfielder, very defensive, very hard man. He played in Italy for long stretches, and so kind of absorbed the Italian style of soccer, which is very defensive-minded. There's a great paradox with the Italian game that the most stylish country on the planet plays some of the least stylish soccer you can imagine.
The absolute least
except
stylish.
for the diving, which is very acrobatic.
And so Dunga has configured the Brazilian team in a way that is very much centered on having 2 burly, strong, thuggish center halves, and then 2 thuggish holding midfielders, defensive midfielders, sitting on top of those guys. And it's not meant to be samba soccer or to replicate the great Brazilian performances of 1970 and 1982, which kind of go down as the platonic ideal of stylish attacking soccer. And so it's generated this whole debate in Brazil whether Brazil is squandering its essential Brazilianness by playing Dunga's style of defensive soccer. Although I think that if anybody saw Brazil play their opening match against North Korea, I don't think you would say that it was an ugly Brazilian performance. I mean, it's still very fluid. It's still based on passing. It's based on buccaneering, I guess is like the cliche word to use, buccaneering fullbacks galloping up the field and making incredible crosses. And Mike Hahn's goal in that match was probably the goal of the tournament so far.
Yeah.
But it is a different Brazil. And you mentioned North Korea. What can we say about North Korea?
Well, I'm just surprised that they did not defect. I know I watched. Yet, I think there are actually
Relatives
3
as
players are
hostages
missing
are,
from their hotel. They're back. Great. Thank you. But when I watched an exhibition game between the U.S. and Cuba last summer or 2 summers ago, and 3 players just ran to the embassy. They did not show up for the game.
Do we think they should be allowed? I mean, clearly the idea that like you should sanction anybody in the sports context seems to be passé. I mean, North Korea is allowed to be there. I mean, South Africa itself is a case of a country that in a different era, it suffered isolationism because of its system, and clearly it was a almost uniquely abhorrent system. But North Korea is a kind of a rogue country that a couple months ago they sank the neighbor ship, and yet it's all good in terms of and maybe I don't know if that's good or bad. Do we have a view on that? I mean.
Well, the fact that they're apparently paying Chinese actors to act as North
Right.
Korean fans,
Because the
that's
fans
probably the
can't come.
storyline of the tournament so far, I think. But yeah, I mean, I don't know whether it was on your blog or there was a news item that was kind of asking whether can you root for North Korea? And I think that, actually watching their performance in the last game, I was pretty impressed. I mean, I would root for North Korea if they went to the knockout round, especially if they were playing against, Mexico or England.
But he wouldn't wear the U.S. tournament jersey.
I know.
Right. No. I
We're gonna have to have a chat afterwards.
I confess to always rooting for underdog teams, even when I feel agnostic. I don't always know until someone scores, and then I'm like, oh, and then you want to root for the team that's behind.
But politics should be
And
completely set
geopolitics
aside.
is-
Like
yeah.
we should not have a kind of
Well, I want to.
human rights standard for
I think that ruins
eligibility
some of
to-
the fun of having
Right.
everybody. Everybody gets to play, and Israel has to play in Europe, but everybody gets to play, and so there's a real competition there, despite the fact that, as we've mentioned, there's only a few teams that win. At least it's open to all comers. So.
I should have mentioned at the outset, and apologies for not doing so, that Peter Beinart was also going to be with us, but he had to be out of town. But he was, I thought of it when you mentioned Israel, because he was looking forward to an opportunity to partake in an event where he didn't have to talk about Israel.
Well, that actually in the last World Cup, I don't know if anybody remembers when John Pansel, the Ghanaian defender, scored a goal. I think it was against USA or the Czech Republic, and he played for an Israeli team, and he yanked out an Israeli flag, and suddenly like the entire Muslim world started rooting against Ghana, and he's like, "What did I do? What did I do?"
But let's open it up to all of you. If you could ask a question or have brief statements are welcome too. But please identify yourself and wait for the microphone, since this is being webcast. And also, when you identify yourself, tell us in one word the country that's going to win the World Cup, since our panelists are hedging.
You haven't asked me yet.
Nick?
No,
One word.
I'll answer later.
All right. I still think it's going to be Spain.
Hey, my name is Samir Vazdev. I'm an intern over at NDN, and I've been obviously following soccer all my life, and I've read your book and loved it, and read a lot about soccer. And I wanted to make one statement and then a question. The statement would be about the GDP thing. I don't know if you guys have read the book by Simon Cooper and Stefan Szymanski, who say that using the GDP, the population of a country, and the number of games it's played internationally throughout its history, you can pretty accurately guess either the goal difference of the games or who will win the game. And then home advantage gives you one extra goal for every 3 games. So that's kind of interesting. It's an interesting book to read. It kind of ruins the fun of soccer because it economizes it, but it's a lot of fun. No offense.
Let's talk later and go to Vegas. Bring the book.
The question is actually a lot less about economy and soccer and everything, but I'm just wondering what you guys think, especially based on today's performance and the referee's performance. Just real quick, if you guys can say yes or no or maybe about whether or not you think instant replay or TV at all or any sort of modern sensible solution to this will ever be conceived of in soccer.
No.
No.
No?
Yeah,
you think
it should, yeah, but it won't.
It won't.
Well, it's interesting because the French France qualified to the World Cup in their game with Ireland based on a Thierry Henry handball, and that seemed to bring this debate. It made it sort of, the debate got to a point where it seemed more likely than I think it's
Well, the great thing
ever
sorry,
been.
The great
but-
thing about soccer, though, is that you can TiVo a game, and you can start it a half an hour late, and in an hour and a half, you can watch an entire match. You can get all the drama, beginning, middle, end. Whereas last night's NBA final, you had to sit there for 3 hours, and
Right.
how many terrible, instant replays and free throws.
Right.
So you start introducing things like instant replay, and then that
Yeah,
great hour and
right.
a half experience suddenly becomes 2
Right.
hours.
And
Do
also-
you have a view on this?
Me?
Yeah,
Oh, absolutely. I'm entirely in favor of
you're in favor. Okay.
Oh, but yeah, I just don't like whistles. I mean, I think it's great when no, I mean like when the ref lets them play, it's always that's what you want to see. It's just annoying when they blow the whistle all the time. And also, again, I mean, the instant replay was very controversial in the 2006 World Cup final, right? That was how they got Zidane because it was off. The ref didn't see it, and so they actually went and watched a video, saw him do the headbutt, and then there was the whole ensuing drama. So with instant replay, without instant replay, you can get away with that, which I thought you should have.
Let's go to the front here. Sorry.
My name is Tom Getman. I have a serious question about women's soccer. But first of all, I should say, we won't tell your colleagues this, but this is a lot more fun than the less important discussions that we have a couple of times a week in this
I
room.
take issue with you calling it less important, but
No, this is the more transcendent compared to what we talk about.
oh, okay,
usually.
got it. Okay,
Yeah.
yeah. No, clearly this is.
And I don't have a clue
You're gonna
about
go
who's
to one
going to
of them.
win, but I helped coach soccer in the 60s and 70s, and it was huge in high schools all up and down the East Coast. And particularly women's soccer was great because women didn't have that much opportunity to play other sports, except field hockey and basketball. And yeah, I think that paid off, as we saw in the Olympics when there were our women doing very well. Do you have a view, Dio, on why we don't have the same enthusiasm that we did have in the 60s and 70s? Because I'm not sure I agree with Mr. Kenny's view of why it faded so fast.
Well, I mean, I was around the 60s and 70s, but I played soccer all through high school from like age 7 until age 18. And I think that it's wonderful that women's soccer in the United States is actually something that we're dominant on. And perhaps it's the extension of what Nick was talking about, the awkwardness of outfits in some countries where women are less empowered. But I think the rallying of folks around, was it 1996, the Women's World Cup?
98?
It's,
98, I think.
It's an odd year, exactly. It's 95, maybe.
97.
90, yeah.
Anyways, late 90s.
But the Brandy Chastain pulling off her jersey, and sliding into the mud, I think was fantastic, and it was something that people were like, yeah, that's great. And obviously there were sort of sexual overtones and a sort of whole discourse surrounding should she have done it, should she have not. But the point is, again, going back to the wonderful egalitarianism of soccer, there is no softball for soccer. It's the same sport, and I think that's really wonderful, and I think it's great. And hopefully, you'll see development. I mean, not only is it more popular than, say, the WNBA, although it's less frequent, obviously the Women's World Cup, hopefully you'll get to see, international play where, America leading the way in terms of the rights of women would continue to lead the way in terms of the expansion of athletic opportunities in women's soccer. So I'm all for it.
I would just add on a personal note that, I grew up in Mexico. I lived there till I was 15, and boys played soccer and girls played basketball. And I had not seen a girl play soccer until I came to the States. And it was such a weird vision when I showed up at this high school in the States and saw girls playing soccer. It just completely blew my mind. I'd just never seen that. And now, of course, now it's so odd to think that, well, why in this kind of macho Mexican culture was basketball deemed more feminine than soccer? Because Americans, if anything, would think of it the other way, and it's all culture, it's all. So it's I think the U.S. had that kind of head start in a way. We have decades of tradition of male soccer in other countries, and for the U.S., there's not. It's more of a kind of, we were kind of at the forefront of that, and the enthusiasm was quite visible in that World Cup, and it was '99, I think. Here in the middle. Yeah.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rosemary Seguero. I'm the president of Hope for Tomorrow. we focus on young people and women, empowering young people and women. I'm so happy for this event, being talked about soccer, and to be honored. You can see I'm putting on an African outfit, honoring soccer in South Africa. My own son, I come from Kenya. My own son is a soccer player. He's in Russia now. He plays for Russia, and also the national team used to play for the national team of Kenya. Since the South African event, my ears are closed. I have men in my place, and it's just too much. And I'm just happy to be here because that's our favorite game. Looking at, when it started, looking at America, America has all kinds of sports, and because of their capability, and now that they are new on soccer, I look at America in future as being the winners of soccer because I see they can do all kinds of sports apart from soccer, and you can imagine what they did in South Africa. So I believe and look at the best at America because they know how they do their sports. So I just wanted to comment on the young lady, Olo Bande, about the wonderful, great honor that South Africa has been given to host this cup with beautiful stadiums, with great events. What about after that? What happens with the stadiums? So we need to look into that and see that those stadiums are used into schools, colleges, manufacturing plants, so that they can empower people, so that they don't say tomorrow South Africa is poor after spending all this money, all the resources and human resources. So I think your idea is good, and let's follow up. And now that everybody's here, let's see that something is done after the soccer. So thank you so much for this great, wonderful event and for honoring South Africa to hold the World Cup. Thank you.
Thank you.
You know, I think the point that you made about the future of soccer is one that's sort of worth discussing. Whether the World Cup of 2040, what are the teams that would be in it and what they would look like. And it was something that I mentioned in the article that I wrote, but the sort of browning of teams, and there was a great New York Times spread about the American players who were first generation or second generation Americans, and obviously all the other sort of, the British team also has folks who are not, British, qua British. The entire French team is African and Arab practically. And so I just wonder what, I guess everyone thinks about what the World Cup, like what are the teams that will be ascendant? Because again, the sort of, Scotland, Ireland, some
Arizona, Secede.
Right. I mean, these are teams that used to be in the World Cup. Sweden isn't in the World Cup this year. They were beaten out at the last minute. And so the question is, one, will these teams continue to sort of become more global looking or more ethnic? Will teams that we never saw in the World Cup, like the Ivory Coast, continue to compete? Or will it be the kind of thing where in the future the U.S. team is so ethnically diverse that we overpower other countries with our sheer pluralism? I don't know. That'll come back around.
Nick, when do you think the U.S. is going to win a World Cup?
4 tournaments, and I think we'll be semifinalists.
Frank?
When I'm dead.
When you're dead. I think we're going to see it sooner rather than later. But
I think
talk about
Germany is kind of a revelation this year. And
yes.
I hesitate to say it's not your grandfather's Germany. They have Mesut Özil, who is probably the first German player to look for inspiration in the Quran. And it's just it's kind of amazing that you have such a multicultural German team. I mean, Italy, I guess there was an article about this in the Times. Rob Hughes, the columnist, wrote about how Italy is kind of one of the last holdouts to be kind of.
Because they never succeeded colonially. They don't have any Ethiopian players to join the team.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, he's a crazy man.
But I mean, sorry, go ahead.
No.
I mean, maybe one day, Ireland is going through this whole sort of cataclysm of having, African immigrants, and Irish identity is so specific that they're dealing with that on a geopolitical level. But also, you could conceivably see an Irish team one day that has a lot of Africans on it, has a bunch of Nigerians that are now,
The question
citizens.
too, though, is how the pluralization, for instance, getting back to Germany, not only does I mean, we talk about the U.S. and thinking that a sort of a more diverse U.S. team, a more international U.S. team makes them more competitive. But think about Germany. I mean, they've won it before, but the style has changed so much because of really because of Ozil. I mean, the creativity on the German team now is the creativity of a borderline South American team. I mean, they looked really efficient, but still creative.
In one game.
Well, yeah.
Against Australia.
They were
Yeah.
playful,
Yeah.
and the passing
I
was
didn't watch
still
this morning, so I can't
efficient. But yeah, they played differently this morning. But I think that you're right. I mean, I think styles change, and I think it'll.
One interesting question about the U.S. soccer team is that despite the great wave of Latino immigration in this country, you know, today I guess Torres started and got yanked at halftime, but other than Boca Negra, who has a Mexican father, I mean, it's just not. We haven't seen the influx of Latinos into the top ranks of U.S. soccer that you would expect.
Well, this maybe goes back to what you were saying, Andres, about the Mexican squad playing for Mexican clubs, and sort of not then getting the sort of cross-pollination that might vault them into the sort of like a rank of the sort of constant appearances in semifinals. And I do think the European teams have the advantage of playing in clubs within Europe that have really different styles and have really different components that are much more international than the American sort of closed system, we might even call it, or the Mexican one, if you wanted to say. I don't know if you want to address that.
Yeah, it's been one of the paradoxes. I mean, again, when I was a kid, Mexico would beat the U.S. 6-7-0 routinely. The U.S. failed to qualify to a lot of World Cups. And on this question of what the profile of countries in say 20, 40 years will look like, FIFA being a monopoly has this delicate balancing act of allotting how many slots for each continent, and they have to revisit that. You could argue that on the merits, Asia, though it's a few number of countries that get to go, might be overrepresented given the level of play, but you want that diversity. They've expanded the field. It was not long ago that you had 16 finalists at the World Cup, now you have 32. But the paradox in our part of the world, in terms of the U.S.-Mexico rivalries, I think Mexico has been held back by the richness of its domestic league. Generally it's the highest paying league outside of Europe. So historically there was very little incentive for Mexican players to go to Europe. They had a hard time adapting. And the food is just really good in Mexico, and so you go to Europe. And if you can make $1 million playing in Mexico, why would you leave? And the U.S. I think has benefited because after the NASL experiment failed in the 70s, if you were a promising American player, even with the more modest MLS, you were going to go to Europe. So the U.S. being sort of I sort of think of it as the China of soccer. You have tremendous numbers of people playing. It's an export-driven economy. So you have these American players, more Americans playing in Europe. Mexico is starting to change a little bit. This new generation, you have Carlos Vela, who's at Arsenal, and Giovanni Dos Santos has been a reserve at Barcelona. And they're mixing it up, and I think that's going to be for the benefit of the Mexican team. But it is a global market. But historically, I mean, some American players would actually go play in Mexico because of the higher salaries. John?
So I'm John from the New America Foundation, a former MSI alumni like Mr. Four. I think Argentina is going to win because I think Maradona has some line to God for the fact that he's even still alive at this point. So my comment sort of is about the sort of African influx into and sort of the globalization and immigration question. And I'm half Swedish, and I've sort of seen this in the Swedish national team in '94 when they made their amazing run into the semifinals and won the third place game. One of their best striker was Martin Dahlin, who was of African descent. Their best player right now is a striker of Eastern European, of Balkan descent, Zlatan Ibrahimovic. And in Norway, their best player is John Carew, also of African descent. So if you can make it in Sweden, and the Norwegian and Danish leagues have a huge influx of African players. And I think you'll see more and more. If you can make it in Scandinavia, there's hope for everyone, I think, at this point. And African soccer, partly because of what we talked about earlier with the shady agents bringing them, it's just a sheer numbers game. And at that point, there's going to be enough that reside in these Norwegian, Danish, and Swedish leagues that one or two are going to break through and become the stars. So more and more you see Swedish kids rooting for Serbs, rooting for Africans, and I think it's actually helped a lot, especially in a country like Sweden where assimilation is still somewhat an issue, especially for Somalis and other refugees.
And certainly Zidane in France, is sort of an example of this. To have the national hero of the '98 World Cup be immigrant.
Algerian-born and French.
Charles, do you have any more thoughts on
I mean, I just agree. I mean, it's schlocky, but it's great that people are sort of viewing when you watch the World Cup, you're looking at people and associating with people on the basis of which team they play for, not the colour of their skin. I mean, that's a very nice thing.
I'm ready to make my prediction.
Okay, go.
2 disclaimers. Spain, Argentina, if Messi plays more in the midfield as he did yesterday compared to the first game where he was playing up front and wasn't getting the ball, then I think that they're unstoppable as long as Messi has the ball 50% of the time. If that doesn't work,
Spoken like a Barcelona fan.
Then I'm pulling for Spain, mainly because they're all from Barcelona.
Well, I'm sorry I punted. I think I like Spain as well to take it, but I'm hoping that they get second in their group because that's the game that I'm going to watch, and I hope Brazil gets first so that I can see both of them. Which
I think
is
it
a
was
lifelong dream.
I think it was good for Spain to get their choke out of the way.
You know what my problem is?
When it's not fatal.
I've been asked so many times to make predictions. I can't remember what I predicted in my last conversation, so I'm afraid I'm going to contradict myself.
But I do think that it's worth saying that the South American performances will continue to be amazing, which is in itself remarkable, given you look at the roster of the former winners. So we have to start saying football.
Yes. Anybody else? In the back there?
William Seymour, International Peace Quest Institute. I'm just curious, more on a maybe social or political level, having the games in South Africa, a country that has a bit of an unsavory reputation in terms of at least safety, which may dissuade some tourists. Do you think that having the games there might raise the country's profile and help attract tourist dollars in a way that, maybe they spend a lot of money on, maybe they get only, a few $100 million in tourist dollars in the short term, but in the next couple of years, will they have more tourists and they'll actually, maybe make their money back?
I don't see photojournalists necessarily flooding to South Africa to be robbed out of their hotel rooms anytime after the World Cup ends. But just call it a hunch.
I mean, I've been before. I'm going again. It's pretty safe. I mean, if you keep your wits about you, and that's the case for most places in Africa. I do think that they should see a return on this investment, and one hopes that there will be other. I mean, the issue with Africa is there's no main city. I guess you could call it Johannesburg, maybe Nairobi, but it's certainly not in the center of the country. That would be the Central African Republic, which would not be a very hospitable host for the World Cup. But maybe you could see the major cities. I mean, I think maybe like 10, right. I think maybe 8 of the biggest 15 cities in the world are in Africa. So maybe you'll see future cups there. But I don't know.
Charles, is there like an intangible goodwill branding payoff that doesn't get factored into this?
Certainly into the calculations I mentioned earlier, but the goodwill better be blooming huge to make up for the gap between the two. And one reason to think it might not be as huge as all that is surveys that asked people where was the Winter Olympics held 6 years ago routinely come back with the fact that nobody can remember. So if the same, it may be different with the World Cup. It may be big enough. But,
I think it is. Winter Olympics.
Nagano?
Who cares about the Winter Olympics?
That would be my guess.
Yeah, well, you see, there we are then. Right, thank you. Right?
Japan?
Yeah, I guess. Anyway, so probably the impact isn't very large. Having said that, I mean, it does seem like there's been a huge amount of free advertising for at least the South African wildlife industry. Pretty much any shot, any story that mentions South Africa holding the World Cup spends a long time on that. So maybe there's some impact.
All right, let's take one more question or comment before we see England lose. Here in the front.
Hi, my name is Mike DeSenza, and my question has a little bit to do with like kind of early stage development. Now, I don't know all that much about soccer, but this past semester I was in an econ class with Sunil Gulati, so I definitely learned a lot more about soccer. He's the head of, I guess, USA Soccer, also from the World Bank a while ago. But, I mean, he talks a lot about early kind of stage childhood, youth leagues, that kind of thing. and a lot of changes that are going on in the U.S. And then also, I mean, I've been hearing about the soccer schools in Nigeria, and it seems like this is a much more formalized way of recruiting African players into European leagues. And it seems like these new initiatives have a lot of pull in terms of publicity, but I'm wondering how much you see changes in really early stage player development affecting countries' success later on.
I'm just thinking back to the New York Times Magazine story from maybe a couple of weeks back about the Ajax program in the Netherlands that takes kids that are like 5 and basically like puts them through a conveyor belt that then produces very valuable, very talented, disciplined players. And the intervention goes as far as, you know, changing the way the kid runs because it's more efficient to run in the Ajax way. And I think that sort of industrial process is valid, and it's certainly been successful for that organization and others like it. But then there's the whole other sort of, you know, the romantic, organic, let's just play with this grapefruit on the, you know, the rocky fields of wherever you are, producing good players. And, you know, I tend to think everyone has agreed that the latter is not the way to do it. And I think you're seeing, as you mentioned, these clubs in Nigeria or other countries that you wouldn't imagine to have put such an investment in these types of things, including the United States, where a lot of it is, you know, soccer moms, right? And it's the most popular sport among tweens in the country right now. And so maybe in the future you'll see very polished young players turn into very lucrative older players. But I think everyone's doing that. It's not.
If you looked at the U.S. soccer team, I think Clint Dempsey went to high school, but I'm not really sure that anybody else went to a proper high school where they played on a high school team. They all get absorbed into sports academies or get into club-based academies. I mean, Donovan, Altidore, Onyewu, Beasley, they all went to this Bradenton Academy, sports academy in Florida, where they get, you know, it's all about.
They play soccer all day.
Yeah, exactly. He ended up going to this thing. He was roommates with, yeah. Yeah.
Well, I guess it's a question you had like with the NBA players, like should they go directly from high school without going to college? Maybe you'll start seeing that all over. I mean, I think in other countries it's much less emphasized, but here maybe we'll start to see that happen too.
Okay, well, thanks everybody for coming. There's empanadas and refreshments. Thank you. And if you can stick around and watch some of the game, we're going to have it on a big screen here.